If this were your child, wouldn't you want to know what happened?
Detail assistance, Vicky speaking. How can I help you?
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come? We have a membership.
All right, of course. How far is the water coming up, sir? Can you give me a description? Ankles?
What'd
Hello?
you say? Hey.
Yes. How far is the water coming up, sir?
It's coming up. We're just sinking. I don't know. Like we're going down now.
What did we just hear? What was that? One more time, please.
Detail assistance, Vicky speaking. How can I help you?
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come? We have a membership.
All right, of course. How far is the water coming up, sir? Can you give me a description? Ankles?
What'd
Hello?
you say? Hey.
Yes. How far is the water coming up, sir?
It's coming up. We're just sinking. I don't know. Like we're going down now.
An 18-year-old goes to a remote island off the coast of Mississippi with his friends. Hours later, he's dead. And the accounts of what happened in between don't line up. Not close. One version says he stayed behind for a girl. Another says he was already heading back to the boat. Both can't be true. Someone in this story is lying. That's not speculation. That's what a former prosecutor said on national television, hours after this young man was buried. Her name is Nancy Grace. And when she said it, this case stopped being a local Mississippi story and became a national one. This is the case of Nolan Wells, a missing phone, 2 conflicting timelines, and a family that says the official version doesn't add up. Welcome back to The Crime Executioner. Independence Day 2026. Nolan Wells left the mainland on a private boat headed for Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by water. He was 18 years old, freshly out of high school, weeks away from his second season as a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. He wasn't going alone. He traveled with a group of friends, the kind of 4th of July trip that happens every year along that stretch of coast. Hundreds of other boats made the same crossing that day. Horn Island fills up on the holiday. Music, coolers, small groups scattered across the sand. The kind of crowd where everyone blends into everyone else. The plan was simple. Spend the day on the island, then head back before evening. 7 people were aboard the boat that carried Nolan's group out. Nothing about the morning suggested anything unusual was coming. At some point that afternoon, the group's boat ran into mechanical trouble. It began taking on water. A call went out to a private towing company to come pull it in. That detail will matter later, because of exactly when that call was made, and exactly when the boat actually left the island. For now, here is what's certain. Nolan Wells arrived on Horn Island with his friends on the morning of July 4th. By the time that boat pulled away from the island later that day, he was not on it. When the boat finally pulled away from Horn Island that evening, Nolan Wells was not on it. His friends made it back to the mainland without him. What happened in the hours before that boat left depends entirely on who you ask. One account says Nolan chose to stay behind. The reason given, a 19-year-old girl named Katie McCormack, who he'd been spending time with on the island that day. In this version, he made the decision himself, planning to find his own way back later. The other account tells a different story. In this version, Nolan was not staying behind by choice. He was already making his way back toward the boat, intending to leave with everyone else, when he became separated from the group in the crowd. Both of these cannot be true at the same time. He could not have chosen to remain behind for Katie McCormack, while also actively returning to the boat with his friends. One account describes a decision. The other describes an accident of timing. There is no version of that afternoon where both hold up. Nolan wasn't reported missing that night right away. By the time his family and investigators began piecing together what happened on that island, the accounts from the people who were with him already didn't line up. That gap between what one group says happened and what another group says happened is where this case actually begins. By the night of July 4th, Nolan Wells had not come home. His family reported him missing, and within hours, The search for him became one of the largest operations that stretch of the Mississippi coast had seen in years. The U.S. Coast Guard joined in. So did the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. The National Park Service, which oversees Horn Island, sent teams as well. Boats swept the surrounding water. Search crews combed the shoreline. For more than 40 hours, agencies worked the case around the clock, with almost nothing to go on beyond the last confirmed sighting of an 18-year-old on a crowded holiday beach. Then, on the morning of July 6th, a Park Service ranger found a body in the water off the northwest tip of Horn Island. It was recovered near the same stretch of shoreline where Nolan had last been seen 2 days earlier. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed the identity through dental records. Nolan Wells, 18 years old, was gone. What began as a missing persons case on a holiday weekend had become something else entirely. And almost immediately, the questions started outpacing the answers. On July 20th, hundreds gathered at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs to say goodbye to Nolan Wells. Coaches stood beside classmates. Teammates sat beside neighbors who had watched him grow up on that same stretch of coast. For a community that had spent 2 weeks searching, waiting, and hoping, this was the day that hope ran out. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, and he didn't just mourn. He asked questions, out loud, in front of everyone. Why had Nolan's friends left him behind on that island? Why had his phone and his keys stayed with them instead of with him? Why had none of them called the police the moment they realized he was missing, instead of waiting? Sharpton didn't offer answers. He simply made sure the questions were heard by everyone in that room. Nolan Wells was laid to rest that day. And just hours later, a woman who had never met him, never set foot on Horn Island, and had no connection to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, sat down in front of a national television audience and gave his case an hour of her show. Her name was Nancy Grace. She didn't break new information. She hadn't been investigating this case behind the scenes. What she did was something else entirely. She looked at what was already public, and she said, out loud, that it didn't add up. That single hour changed the trajectory of everything that came after it.
Did you just hear what I heard? Now, this has been transcribed, and this is the CTO dispatch call. Because, Dave, when I first heard this, I thought, has this been doctored? Is this real? Where's this coming from, Dave?
Nancy, this is coming from from Mississippi, from the actual official. Okay, when we get into the Mississippi Fish and Wildlife and at the reserve putting this out for the public, this is not like from Dave Mack's recording. This is an official recording, Nancy, that is being issued, and it's shocking when you listen to this call for a tow, for the CTO. Going further into it, Nancy, you're picking apart all of the different voices that can be heard on this one phone call, trying to determine what is really taking place on this boat that is allegedly sitting in 31 feet of water.
To understand what it meant for Nancy Grace to take this case, you have to understand where she came from. Long before television, Nancy Grace was a prosecutor in Atlanta, Georgia, spending years trying felony cases, many of them violent crimes. Her path into that courtroom wasn't accidental. Her fiancé was murdered when she was in her 20s, and by her own account, that loss is what pushed her toward prosecuting the kinds of cases most people spend their lives trying to avoid. She built a reputation there for being relentless. Prosecutors who knew her described someone who didn't back down, who pushed hard for convictions, and who treated victims' families as people she was personally accountable to. Eventually, she left the courtroom for the television screen. She became a fixture on cable news, first as a legal analyst, then as the host of her own show, where she spent nearly a decade covering crime stories from across the country. That show made her one of the most recognized names in American true crime media. Her style never softened for television. She remained direct, often blunt, unwilling to let law enforcement or prosecutors off the hook when she believed they were moving too slowly or saying too little. That same style built her a loyal, devoted audience. It also built her critics. Over the years, there were cases where Grace reached conclusions early and publicly, ahead of the facts, in ways that didn't hold up once more evidence came in. Both of those things are part of her record. The advocate who forces institutions to answer for themselves, and the broadcaster whose certainty sometimes outran the truth. That is the person who sat down in front of a camera, hours after Nolan Wells was buried, and told her audience that something about his case didn't add up. When Nancy Grace opened her show that day, she went straight at two things. The first was the timeline itself. She laid out the two competing versions of Nolan's final hours, the one where he chose to stay behind, and the one where he was already heading back to the boat with everyone else. And she made a simple point. Those two versions cannot both be accurate. Someone was giving an account that didn't match what actually happened. She didn't say who. She just said the math didn't work, and that somebody involved wasn't telling the full story. The second thing she zeroed in on was Nolan's phone. She raised the fact that his mother had gone through his accounts after his disappearance and found that different location tracking services were showing conflicting information, readings that didn't match each other and didn't match where his body was ultimately found. Grace argued that a small discrepancy might be explained away as ordinary technical error, but she said the gap being described was too large for that kind of easy explanation, and she wanted to know why nobody investigating the case seemed to be asking harder questions about it. She delivered both points with the certainty of someone who had spent years standing in front of juries. To her audience, it sounded less like a media personality speculating and more like a former prosecutor cross-examining a case file in real time. But raising a question on television is not the same as answering it. Grace wasn't presenting new evidence. She was reacting to what was already public and framing it in a way that made millions of people pay closer attention. So the real question isn't whether Grace sounded convincing, it's whether the actual investigative record, the timeline, the dispatch calls, the digital evidence, backs up what she was implying. That's where this case goes next. Nancy Grace just told a national audience that the timeline doesn't add up, and the phone data raises real questions. Before you accept either claim, you need to see what investigators actually found. Subscribe now, because the next chapter puts her claims directly against the evidence, and what shows up in the dispatch records might not match what you just heard. Here is what the actual record shows. Investigators obtained audio from a dispatch call placed that afternoon to a private towing company called Sea-Tow. The call came from someone aboard the boat that had brought Nolan's group to Horn Island. The caller reported that the boat was taking on water, gave its GPS coordinates off the northwest tip of the island, and asked to be towed back to the mainland. That call was made around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. According to GPS records obtained separately, the boat did not actually leave Horn Island until roughly 4:30. That's about 30 minutes after the call reporting engine trouble was placed. That 30-minute window matters, because it directly complicates the version of events where Nolan made a clear, early decision to stay behind. If the boat itself wasn't in any condition to leave until 4:30, then whatever happened between Nolan and his friends in that window happened while the boat carrying them was still sitting there taking on water, not already gone. There's also the matter of who else was on that island that day. Crime scene analyst Cheryl McCollum reviewed the dispatch audio and the GPS data publicly, and she raised a detail that's easy to overlook. Horn Island was packed that day. Hundreds of people were out there for the holiday. McCollum pointed out how strange it is that no one recalls seeing Nolan after he became separated from his friends, given how many cameras and phones were pointed at that beach all afternoon. Investigators have been working through footage from strangers who had no idea they may have captured him in the background of their own videos. Then there's the viral video. In the days after Nolan's disappearance, a clip began circulating online of someone yelling on the island.
Now, it's my understanding, Dave Mack, that sound we just played is real sound. That is not doctored sound, but someone else claims that's them saying, "Give me my phone back." That is not Nolan Wells. Explain.
Speculation spread that it showed some kind of confrontation involving Nolan. A friend of his, Trayston Shepard, addressed that video publicly and said the yelling voice on that recording was her own, not evidence of any altercation. So measure that against what Nancy Grace said on television. She was right that the two accounts of that afternoon can't both be true. But the dispatch records add something she didn't have in front of her when she said it. The boat wasn't gone at 4, it didn't leave until 4:30. And whatever decision got made about Nolan staying behind, it wasn't made after his friends had already left the island without him. There are two autopsies in this case, and understanding the difference between them matters. The first was conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office on July 7th, one day after Nolan's body was recovered. As of this recording, those results, including toxicology, have not been released to the public. The second was an independent autopsy, commissioned by Nolan's family and their legal team, and paid for by former NFL player Colin Kaepernick. It was performed by a forensic pathologist named Dr. Mitchell, and the results were announced publicly on July 22nd. Mitchell's findings were preliminary, and they were limited by two things. The body had already undergone significant decomposition by the time it reached him, and several parts of Nolan's body, including internal structures of his throat, had not been sent along with him for this second examination. That's not necessarily unusual. Retaining tissue for further review is a common practice in forensic pathology. But it meant Mitchell couldn't examine that area himself. What he did find was a 12 by 8 inch area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's skull, over what's called the occipital bone. He could not determine what caused it. He found no fractures, no lacerations, no deep tissue injuries anywhere else on the body. Because he didn't have access to Nolan's throat structures, his airway, or his stomach contents, all retained during the first autopsy, Mitchell said he could not rule out an injury to the neck as a contributing factor in Nolan's death. His official conclusion was that the cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending further investigation. Coroner Bruce Lind had stated publicly that there were no immediate signs of physical injury, but outside experts pushed back on how quickly that conclusion was reached. Forensic pathologist and former medical examiner Dr. Michelle Dupree said publicly that ruling out foul play so soon, before a full and complete examination was even possible, was premature. So does the autopsy confirm what Nancy Grace suspected? Not exactly. It doesn't prove foul play, but it doesn't rule it out either. What it shows is a body examined twice, with critical pieces missing both times, and a discoloration nobody can yet explain. Underscore. Grace wasn't the only major name to attach herself to this case. Attorneys, civil rights leaders, athletes, and television personalities all entered the picture, some pushing the same theory, some pushing back against it entirely. Subscribe now, because the next chapter breaks down exactly who got involved, and why their names carry as much weight as the evidence itself. Nancy Grace wasn't operating alone. By the time she sat down in front of her cameras, several other prominent names had already attached themselves to this case, and more would follow after her. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump was already representing Nolan's family before Grace ever covered the case. It was Crump who commissioned the independent autopsy, who pushed for transparency from Mississippi investigators, and who stood in front of cameras to announce Dr. Mitchell's findings when they came in. Reverend Al Sharpton had already delivered his eulogy at Nolan's funeral, publicly questioning why his friends left him behind that day. Sharpton stayed involved well beyond that service, continuing to call for accountability from local authorities. Tyler Perry covered the costs of Nolan's funeral. He didn't do this quietly either. Perry spoke publicly about his own experience seeking answers after a family member died in custody, and said he understood exactly what Nolan's parents were going through. Colin Kaepernick, the former NFL quarterback, funded the independent autopsy that Dr. Mitchell performed. Without that funding, the discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull might never have become public information at all. Sports commentator Stephen A. Smith raised the case on national television as well, separate from Grace's coverage, arguing that any parent sending their child out for a holiday expects that child to come home, and pressing for the investigation to move faster. Not every major voice that entered this case agreed with the direction Grace was pushing it. Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI agent, reviewed the same public evidence and reached a different conclusion. She said what she saw pointed toward an accident, not foul play, though she cautioned that more details could still surface that might change that assessment. So by the time this case reached a national grand jury, it wasn't just carrying the ATC. So what did Nancy Grace's involvement actually change? It didn't determine how Nolan Wells died. No broadcast can do that. It didn't produce new evidence, and it didn't replace the work investigators still had to do. Grace herself has no authority to indict anyone, arrest anyone, or compel a single agency to release a single document. What her broadcast did was apply pressure. Within the reaction to her episode, this case stopped being treated as a routine drowning and started being treated as a story the public expected answers on. That kind of pressure has a track record of speeding up institutional response, even when it can't determine an outcome. It's also worth being honest about what was already moving before she got involved. Ben Crump had already commissioned the independent autopsy. Colin Kaepernick had already agreed to fund it. Sharpton had already used Nolan's funeral to raise hard questions. Grace amplified a case that already had serious people asking serious questions. She didn't start that momentum from nothing, but her broadcast is the point where it became undeniable and impossible for local officials to treat quietly. That's the actual function of a spotlight like hers. It doesn't solve a case. It makes a case very difficult to let go unsolved. As of this recording, Nolan Wells' case has been referred to a Mississippi grand jury. The state's original autopsy, along with its toxicology results, still has not been released to the public. Investigators continue reviewing footage and photographs from bystanders who were on Horn Island that day, hoping something in the background of someone else's holiday video holds the answer nobody has found yet. Nothing about this case is resolved. Not the cause of death. Not what happened in that 30-minute window before the boat left the island. Not why the accounts from that day still don't line up. This case is headed to a grand jury, and whatever they decide will be the first real answer anyone has gotten in this investigation. Subscribe now, because when that decision comes down, this channel will be the place to understand exactly what it means and what it doesn't. Every true crime case eventually asks its audience the same question. What actually moves justice forward? The facts themselves, or the attention those facts manage to attract? Nancy Grace's involvement in this case put that question on full display. A television host with no investigative power and no legal authority looked at a grieving family's case and refused to let it fade into the background. That refusal mattered. It's the reason millions of people know Nolan Wells' name, and the reason officials in Mississippi are operating under a level of scrutiny they weren't facing before she got involved. But a spotlight can only do one thing well. It can keep a door open. It cannot walk through that door itself. It cannot examine a body, analyze a phone record, or explain a discoloration on the back of a skull. Only evidence can do that. Somewhere in an unreleased toxicology report, in a set of retained tissue samples, in the footage of strangers who didn't know they were filming him, the actual answer to what happened to Nolan Wells already exists. Nancy Grace made sure the world kept watching for it. Whether the world ever gets to see it is still entirely up to the evidence.